Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Welcome specifically to a paper called Morphology and Syntax. The teacher for this paper is Probal Dasgupta. I work at the Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata, or if you prefer the old name, Calcutta. Morphology looks at what words are like. Syntax looks at what sentences are like. Morphology flows into syntax as you put the words together, first to make phrases and then to combine the phrases into sentences. You might, of course, be itching to ask the question, then how come you don't have three branches of linguistics, one covering words, one covering phrases, and one covering sentences? How come you cover phrases and sentences in a single branch called syntax? Why aren't there three branches? Morphology covering words, syntax covering sentences, and something else, call it phrase tax or whatever, that covers only phrases. That's a valid question. It's important to begin by asking valid questions. And if that has occurred to you, we are happy that that question has occurred to you. The reason why we don't have a separate branch of linguistics studying phrases and then another branch of linguistics studying sentences is that the mechanisms which put words together into bigger units acts in the same way when words are put together into phrases and when phrases are put together into sentences. What do we mean by this? For example, if you take two phrases like the quick brown fox and the phrase the lazy dog, and when you put these together to make up the bigger phrase, the quick brown fox and the lazy dog, you get a bigger phrase out of two smaller phrases. But did you notice what we did? We didn't simply put the two phrases together. We took the first phrase, the quick brown fox, and the second phrase, the lazy dog, and we joined them using some glue in the middle. What was the glue? The glue was the word and, which is called a conjunction. Not always, however. Sometimes two phrases are connected not by attaching words to them, but by attaching something else from the morphology, which is called an affix. For example, if you want to say in Hindi, Ram ke Pitaji, and you want to join that with a second phrase, Sita ki Mataji, you can join the two, of course, in the English style by using the conjunction or. You can say Ram ke Pitaji or Sita ki Mataji. Fine. Instead of that, you can also use a bit of morphology. You can use what is called a focal clitic bhi. You can say Ram ke Pitaji bhi, Sita ki Mataji bhi aaye hain. Now when you do that, the two bhis which are attached to their respective phrases perform the task of joining the phrases together, even though there is no conjunction, there is no or. Notice that this is something English does not allow you to do. In English, you cannot attach something to the first phrase and something to the second phrase and say, look, I've now put the two phrases together and they've been conjoined. So in that kind of example, you see, morphology, in other words, the attachment of bhi, is performing the task of syntax, of putting two phrases together to make a bigger phrase. That is why when we do morphology and syntax, it is efficient to do the two subjects together, because morphology is concerned with words, syntax is concerned with putting words together, and sometimes the morphology spills over into putting words together. For example, suppose you have something like the good boy has run. अच्छा लड़का दौड़ चुका है. Suppose instead of one good boy, you have a lot of good boys and you say अच्छे लड़के दौड़ चुके हैं. Or in English, you want to say this by saying the good boy has run and the good boys have run. As you can see, putting the subject, the good boy, with the predicate has run together into the sentence, the good boy has run, involves the morphology, which looks at the fact that the good boy is a singular phrase headed by the singular noun boy, and the predicate has run is headed by the singular verb has. When you change the subject into the plural subject, the good boys, with the plural noun boys, likewise the predicate has to change. The head of the predicate stops being has, which is singular, and becomes have, which is plural. You do this in Hindi also. You get acha ladka, singular, daud chuka hai, singular chuka. And achhe ladke, the good boys, daud chuke hain, with a chuke, which is plural, which is an exact translation of these English examples. Here you see that the morphology, which changes according to the number, also plays a role in putting the subject and the predicate together. So this is why we are teaching morphology and syntax together, but you need to understand at the very start that linguistics is concerned with putting these things together so that you get an account of how you know your language or what you know when you know your language. Even though you as a speaker do everything at the same time, you pronounce it, you understand it, you put the pieces together, and when you're speaking or understanding something, you don't distinguish the pronunciation from the meaning, from the combination of words and so on. Nonetheless, when we analyze what you're doing, we have to make these distinctions. So we begin not by teaching you how morphology and syntax are connected. We begin in the first module by just teaching morphology. And we look at the most elementary notions. We look at what a word is like, how one word is made from another word. In order to do that, you need to look at some examples. And we think it's best if you begin with some really crazy examples. That's why we want to take you to French. In French, when they say I go, you go, we go, you plural go, it comes out as je vais, tu vas, nous allons, vous allez. As you see, vais, va, allons, aller don't look like one verb at all. They look like completely different words. So French morphology answers the question, what do you need to say about French words when you're describing the French language? That is called French morphology. Now, why am I teaching you morphology? What is morphology in general? That answers the question, when you're describing language as a whole, what do you need to say about words in general? That is the subject called general morphology. General morphology answers the question, when you're describing language as a whole, what do you need to say about words in general? Now, you're not tuned into that question. You think about one language at a time quite naturally. So depending on your learning style, some of you will want to concentrate on your mother tongue. Some of you who are learning a different language like English or some foreign language will want to think about words in that language most of the time. Each of you will find your own mix among the two. We don't need any particular concentration. You can do both. You can look at either your language or at English. Now, since many people who are going to be following this course know Hindi Urdu, we are also giving Hindi Urdu examples. By Hindi Urdu, we mean the common core which is shared by Hindi and Urdu. We'll be calling it Hindi Urdu in this course. Now, look at the English data, sin and sinless, pain and painless, child and childless. As you can see, there's something going on here. Similarly, in Hindi Urdu, if you look at the data, guna and beguna, chara and bechara, fikr and befikr, you see roughly the same stuff, even though the words don't exactly match the English words. What exactly is going on here? Now, normally people say in English there is a suffix less. You attach the suffix less to sin and you get sinless. You attach it to pain and you get painless. Likewise, you say in Hindi there is a prefix be. You attach be to guna and you get beguna. Now, what do you mean by this? Think about the word sinless. When you say somebody is sinless, are you saying that person commits less sin than somebody else? Or are you saying the person commits no sin at all? Consider calling a person sinful. When you say someone is sinful, are you saying he or she is full of sin? If a sinful person is full of sin, then the opposite should be sin empty. But you never call a person sin empty, do you? Likewise, when you speak of a place as the northernmost point of Goa, Do you mean the most northern point of Goa? If you do, why don't you say Delhi is northern more than Nagpur? You don't say that, do you? So you can see that the belief that less is part of sinless doesn't really work. When you talk about a painless death, you think of a death without pain. This is a different problem. This is not about the word less, this is about the other part of the word. When you speak of someone as a reckless driver, you're not saying that person doesn't have any wreck. Why? Because there is no such word as wreck. Likewise, when you say a ruthless examiner, you're not saying the examiner doesn't have any ruth, because there is no such thing as ruth. If somebody learns Hindi Urdu and learns the word Beokoof, I have learned the word Beokoof. I don't know if there is a word Wakoof or what the word Wakoof means. Do I have to learn the word Wakoof in order to learn Beokoof? No, it doesn't matter if there is a word Wakoof or not. Likewise, an author doesn't author even though a director directs. In author, even though is supposed to be a suffix, you're not accountable for what the rest of the word is like. This makes you realize slowly that a word is not made up of little words put together to make big words. It doesn't make sense to think of sinless as having the two words sin and less stitched together. You need to think of the whole thing as a whole, not in terms of little pieces. What does that mean? That means that even though English has the word less and Hindi doesn't have the word be, there is really no difference between Hindi beguna and its English equivalent sinless. Sinless depends very little on the word less. Beguna doesn't need there to be a word be in Hindi, and as you know, there is no word be in Hindi. If you think of big words as being made of little words, you're missing the point. Be is not a word. Less in sinless, even though it looks like the word less, is not the word less. Something different is going on. What is happening is that one word is formed from another word by a process. We call these things word formation processes. The whole subject matter of morphology is word formation processes. For example, if you have a noun in English, you can make up an adjective by attaching less to that noun. That's all there is to say. You're not referring to a separate word less when you do this. The noun means something and the adjective means devoid of that something. That is the second part of the statement. The first part of the word formation process says that you're attaching less to the X if X is a noun. And the second part says X means something and X less means devoid of that something. When you apply such a word formation process to a particular word like pain, pain counts as the X. So when you apply the word formation process to pain, you get painless by applying it. The left-hand side says X, pain matches that left-hand side. The right-hand side says X-less, so that comes out as painless. This is how things work. In the case of pain, painless, the meaning of pain is ache. Ache matches the something in the meaning statement. And painless matches devoid of ache, which matches devoid of something in the meaning statement. Now we move to how the morphology interacts with the pronunciation of the word. The pronunciation is studied in a branch of linguistics called phonology. Phonology, for our purposes in this module, has to do with some automatic adjustments which will slightly change the form that you're looking at. I'll give you an example from English to start with. In English, you know that you can take an adjective and make an adverb by attaching "ly" to it. From the adjective slow, you can make the adverb slowly. From the adjective rapid, you can make the adverb rapidly. From hasty, you can make hastily. This is easy, and by now you know how to write a word formation process for this. On the left-hand side, you will have X saying adjective. On the right-hand side, you will have X-ly saying adverb. That is very simple. You understand easily how to go from X to X-ly when it's a matter of words like rapid to rapidly and slow to slowly and hasty to hastily. Now let us look at a case where you need to understand where the phonology comes in. Consider the word simple. From simple, you're not supposed to get simply, right? From nimble or ample, you're not supposed to get nimbly or amply, right? Instead, you should get simply with a double L, amply with a double L, nimbly with a double L. But good heavens, nobody says that, do they? What is really happening, you see, is that speakers are trying to say simply, amply, and nimbly, but in fact they find they cannot say this. English stops them. English phonology stops them and automatically adjusts their pronunciation. So they end up saying simply, amply, nimbly with a single L. How do you say it in linguistics? You say that the morphology is trying to attach li, but the phonology makes an automatic adjustment when it sees that you're trying to do a double L. Because English doesn't allow a double L, the result is you get simply, amply, and nimbly. Now this is what we have to now say technically. So what happens is there's a word formation process for English that takes X, which is an adjective, and turns it into Xly, which is an adverb, where X means such and such, and the right-hand side of the rule means such and in such and such a fashion. Now that you can see that this second line of the word formation process statement, which talks about the meaning, is something fairly silly. It says something or such and such in such and such a fashion. You realize that there is no point repeating these inanities. So from this point onwards in the rest of the course, we will not show you the second line explicitly. But please understand that whenever there is a word formation process, there is in fact a second line covering the meaning. Just as the first line covers the form, the second line covers the meaning. Even though we are only showing you the form, remember at all times that the word formation process has an expression line showing the expression side and a content line, which we will not show from now on. That doesn't mean that we are dropping the second line. It simply means that we're going to treat it as obvious. Now, when you do exercises for the Hindi data and from the English data, you will need to, in the first part of this course, practice until you get all the details right. One of the difficulties that learners have in understanding how the morphology works and how the phonology works is they get the two mixed up. They feel like writing a word formation process for those words which end in L, like simple, and say, look, in this case, the morphology doesn't add li, it adds e. In other words, beginners want to write a process that says, if you have XL on the left, then you should have XLI on the right, adding only E, the E sound, which is written as I in the notation. Why we should not do that is because morphology and phonology do two separate jobs. Morphology is responsible for the overall shape of the word. It more or less gets the word right. Phonology is responsible for implementing the laws of the pronunciation. In the case of English, these laws include the fact that English doesn't allow a double L. When a speaker of English hears that Muslims use the name Allah for God, an ordinary speaker of English cannot say Allah. They will always say Allah with a single L. Likewise, if there is an Indian girl who meets a native speaker of English and says, hello, my name is Jilli, the speaker of English will say, hello, Jilli, because they can't say Jha and they can't say a double L, so they can't say Jilli. They adjust the Jha into the Jha that they can say and the double L into the single L that they can say. That is how phonology works for every language. In Hindi, for example, there is no double L problem. Hindi speakers easily say Jilli, Billi, and so on. So if a Hindi speaker is learning English, what tends to happen is a speaker learning that there is a word legal in English and trying to form an adverb is very naturally likely to say the adverb coming from legal is the word legally. And the speaker of Hindi needs to be taught, listen, in English one does not say legally with a double L. You have to make that a single L. You have to say legally. So the speaker of Hindi has to make a special effort and consciously learn that instead of saying legally, in fact, English requires you to say legally. Why is this happening? This is not a morphological fact about English. English morphology tries to make everybody, even native speakers of English, form the word legally from the adjective legal. But because of English phonology, which does not allow legally with a double L on the phonetic surface of English, the result is that a speaker of English will automatically say legally when they're trying to say legally. Now, for this very first time, although we will not normally show you how to do an exercise, for this absolutely first module, I think it's best if we do some hand-holding for you, okay? So, when you are going to do this for Hindi, guna and beguna, we want you to think carefully about what is happening. What is happening is guna, beguna, fikr, befikr, chara, bechara. What is happening is each time there is a noun in Hindi, you're going to call the noun X, and then you're going to make an adjective out of that noun. You're going to take the noun and attach a be to the left. So what your statement needs to say is that if there is a noun, call it X. You will write X and put square brackets on both sides of X. And at the bottom of the right-hand square bracket, in very small letters, you will write either the full word noun or you will use a short form like capital N for noun. Now you'll have an arrow saying that we're going to do something to this noun whose shape is X. By X, you mean anything. What are you going to do to that shape? You're going to attach a be to the left of the shape. You will perform prefixation of be to the noun. The way to write that is you write B-E capital X. We're using capital X for the variable. This is called a variable because the X can be anything. So small b, small e, capital X with a left bracket on the left. And to the right you have a right bracket under which as a subscript you're going to write A, short for adjective, or you'll write the full word adjective, depends on your conventions. You're welcome to write the full words noun and adjective, or the short forms N and A, or the short forms N and ADJ. That doesn't matter, provided you have a consistent use of the same convention. It doesn't really matter what convention you follow. We hope you understand that the conventions we are using in the material we are showing you in these lectures is not sacrosanct. It is not carved in stone. You're welcome to change the conventions to something that you find convenient. So as you see, for English, we had to write X and X less, whereas for Hindi, you will have to write X and be X, because Hindi puts the be material to the left of the variable, whereas English puts the less material to the right of the variable. We want you to appreciate that languages differ on many dimensions. Some differences between languages are morphological differences. The fact that English attaches less to the right of sin and gets the word sinless from sin, whereas Hindi attaches be to the left of guna and gets beguna from guna, not guna be. That is a morphological difference between Hindi and English, not a phonological difference. In contrast, when you look at the fact that Hindi allows words like Allah and Billi to keep their double L, whereas in English, a word like legal plus li comes out not as legally but as legally. That is a phonological difference between English and Hindi. When you try to learn each branch of linguistics, a lot of learning happens at the boundary between that branch and some other branch. So as you can see in this module, we are covering morphology, and we have to begin by showing you where morphology ends and phonology begins. In other parts of this paper, Morphology and Syntax, we will show you more about where syntax ends and morphology begins, or where morphology ends and syntax begins. Every branch of linguistics needs to be understood in relation to its neighbors. There are always boundaries to maintain. Certain things happen across these boundaries, so there are important relations that cross the boundaries. At the same time, you need to maintain the boundaries, otherwise you will get everything mixed up and not be able to do linguistics at all. One of the difficulties in learning linguistics, you see, this is something we need to stress in the very first module, is that we all know our mother tongue and often a couple of other languages. So we imagine that we understand how language works. The first thing you need to learn when you're doing linguistics is that our common sense understanding and of spontaneous knowledge that allows us to speak a language, in fact, does not work as a basis for a theoretical account of how it all works. In order to understand language as a linguist, you have to step back from your knowledge of the language, either as a native speaker or as a foreign speaker. You have to step back and take a look at your knowledge and break it up into bits and pieces. And this does not come naturally to us. No speaker without special training is able to say, I know this because I know the phonology of my mother tongue, I know that because I know the morphology of my mother tongue, I know that because I know the syntax of my mother tongue. These boundaries are not obvious at all. If they were obvious to ordinary speakers of a language, then there would be no need to invent linguistics. Linguistics would come for free every time you learn a language. But that is not how it happens. So when we show you these obvious facts, facts that you have known for a long time, like sin and sinless in English or guna and beguna in Hindi Urdu, you will think, why are they spending time showing us what is obvious? We want you to look at what is obvious to you so that you can begin to see what is not obvious. Before we end this module, it's a good idea to quickly rehearse what has happened this time. We began by telling you how morphology and syntax are connected, but we immediately showed you that to look at them clearly, you first have to disconnect them and study one thing at a time. So we began by looking at morphology separately, and that involved showing you how a word formation process takes one kind of word and makes another kind of word. And we gave you an example that in English you can take a noun and make an adjective from it by taking the noun and attaching less at the right-hand side. So you get sinless from sin. Likewise in Hindi, Urdu, you can take words like guna and chara and make adjectives from those nouns by attaching be on the left. So you get beguna and bechara. Now we immediately took you into the fact that morphology doesn't work on its own, it works with the phonology. So here we show you in this module how the morphology has something separate to say, how the phonology has something separate to say, but how the two combine to give you what look like a single knowledge of English or a single knowledge of Hindi. That is enough for the day. If you want to know more, you need to look at the e-text carefully. And although this particular e-text for the very first module doesn't suggest any further reading, in the rest of the paper you're going to find suggestions for further reading. Happy study.